thank you all for coming. This is practical side channel attacks against WPA-TKIP, and my name is Domien Schepers, and I'll be presenting some work I did together with Anjan Ranganathan and Mathy Vanhoef. So in this session, we will be talking about WPA-TKIP, which is a Wi-Fi security protocol, and we'll demonstrate some new side channel attacks that are very easy to implement and much faster to execute than existing work. All right, sorry about that. So here we go again. I'll be talking about practical side channel attacks against WPA-TKIP, which is one of the Wi-Fi security protocols. And before we get started, we can run over a brief Wi-Fi history. So originally, we had wired equivalent privacy, which is called WEP, and soon after, there were many flaws identified in this. And the IEEE decided we should have a more secure Wi-Fi encryption protocols, and as an intermediate solution, they came up with a TKIP protocol. And this was an intermediate solution because they wanted this enhanced security to be able to run on older hardware of devices that were designed to run web. After this, they came up with the CCMP protocol, which is known as WPA2, which is now used most of the time. And then we have WPA3 since last year. So if you look at this timeline, we see that the TKIP protocol was already announced in 2003. Yet, I am here today still talking about this. And that immediately raises the question, why will I be talking about a protocol that is almost 16 years old? And there's a few reasons for that. It is still not marked as obsolete by the IEEE today. And that's maybe part of this results into commercial products that are sold today that will still support the TKIP protocol. And when we saw that this still is the case, we decided to do some wardriving experiments to see how much is this still used in practice. And following some of these results, we decided it's still very interesting to look in TKIP. So in May 2018, just last year, TKIP was still not marked as obsolete. Even at the time, the protocol was already 15 years old, and WPA3 was about to be announced. So with some Wi-Fi survey we did in a bunch of different countries, we came to the realization that it's still used in almost 45% of all the networks that support encryption. And that's a very large number. Still, 16 years after its release, it's still used this much. And I must say with this, there is a very large variation depending on the country where we tested this. And the two extremes were Belgium and Germany, where in Belgium it's used almost 60% of the networks, whereas in Germany it was around half with 30%. So even at its best case, if you will, it's still used 30%, which is still way too much. So this motivated us to look into some of these TKIP implementations and see how we can find some new vulnerabilities with this, with the hope of finally deprecating this protocol. So I will be talking about a brief background about TKIP and some of the existing attacks. Then I'll present our side channels, which we tested against a bunch of operating systems, such as Linux and OpenBSD. And we also tested a bunch of devices for which we could find some source code, which were MediaTek and Broadcom devices. And then hopefully, we'll be able to show a demonstration of this and make a conclusion. So the TKIP protocol provides better integrity protection than its predecessor, which was WEP. So in order to achieve this, it added a MIC, which is an integrity check value. And this covers not only the plain text bytes, but also the source and destination MAC addresses. And this MIC is added to the last fragment, and this will be important in our side channel attacks because it means if you have to fragment a larger frame, the MIC will only be attached to the last of these fragments, which means the receiver has to receive all frames, reassemble them, and only then the receiver is able to verify if the MIC is correct. This is something we will be using in our side channel attacks to avoid the recipient from validating the MIC. Additionally, the TKIP header also has an enhanced sequence counter, which is used for a replay protection. So soon after its release, there were a lot of issues already identified with this. It says the Michael-Mick is invertible. This means that if we know a plain text message and we have the Michael-Mick code for this message, we can, with a very simple function, retrieve the key that was used to generate this Michael-Mick code. And because of these issues, the specification also defines a few countermeasures that state what one should do if some of these invalid Michael-Micks are received. And this is what they call a Michael-Mick failure report. And if a access point receives 2 of these frames in 1 minute, it will block all TKIP traffic. And this is a protection mechanism to avoid that an adversary is able to perform some attacks against it. And after this 1 minute, all clients have to reassociate and negotiate fresh keys. Also defined in the IEEE is the E amendment, which defines quality of service channels, which means it prioritizes traffic, for example, when you make a phone call over Wi-Fi. And the Michael-Mick also covers this priority number. And in our side channel soon, we'll see how there's something interesting about this quality of service, namely that the TKIP sequence counter is unique for each channel. So each channel has its own TKIP sequence counter. And we'll see how we can abuse this feature to inject some network traffic later on. So already in 2004, there was a so-called ChopChop attack described against web. And in 2009, backend 2s presented a modification to this attack that works against WPA-TKIP. And what it does is it chops off the last byte, makes a correction for the ICV, and there is a way, due to the CRC cyclic redundancy check linearity, that allows us to reconstruct a valid ICV of this. And to make this more visual, how this works like is, in TKIP, we have this encrypted data. So we have no idea what the plain text is, but we do know that the last 4 bytes are the ICV. So it is possible to chop off the last byte of this frame. And now we can make an ICV correction that will result in a valid frame. But in order to do so, we need to know what the plain text value of this byte was. As an adversary, you do not know what this plain text value is. So you have to try 265 times for each of the possible values. And if you make a wrong guess, then this ICV is not valid, which means this frame is corrupt. However, if you made a right guess, then this is a valid message, which means on average, in 128 times, we can figure out what is the plain text value based on this ICV correction. So if you know that you made a successful guess, then you have successfully decrypted the last byte. So that brings us to a very important question. How do we know if we made the correct ICV correction? That is, how do we know we made the correct guess for that plain text byte? And that is the side channels. So from now in the remainder, we'll run over a bunch of side channels that will help us identify if we made a correct guess on this chopped off byte or not. So what we want to achieve is, can we find side channels that allow us to detect if a TKIP frame is accepted by the recipient? That is, if the ICV check was successful. And we want to find a way where we can craft TKIP frames such that the state of the receiver is modified in a way that we can later on detect. That means if we made a correct ICV guess, then we can see this change, and then we can detect this, and that's how we know that we made a correct guess for this plain text byte. And we will analyze a bunch of TKIP implementations to see if we can find such side channels. And for this, we analyzed the full Wi-Fi stack. That's something that wasn't really done before, and with analyzing Wi-Fi protocols at least, and that will be one of our main takeaways of today, meaning we should do more of these full stack analysis, because we will see how with the hardware features, there's features like hardware decryption features where you can offload encryption to the hardware drivers. And we'll see how we can exploit this to find these side channel attacks. So we will be looking for these cross-layer side channel vulnerabilities, and we will find some issues in power management features, fragmentation, and these hardware decryption. So power management features were defined in the E amendment, and it defines features such as UAPSD, which means a client can do unscheduled, go into power mode in an unscheduled interval, which means the client can indicate it's going to sleep to save some power, and it will then notify the access point, hey, I'm awake, you can now send me all your data. And it requests new data using a power safe poll frame. So what this could look like is a client sends a frame to the access point, it sets the power management flag in its header, then it means the client will go to sleep, the access point will buffer all data that is intended to be transmitted to this client, and when the client indicates through the power safe poll frame, hey, I'm awake, then the access point will send either all the buffered data, or it will send a null data frame. And we can build a side channel around this, because we can spoof a target client to make it look that it's entering power save mode while it's not in reality, and then we can request data. And if the access point replies with the data or the null data frame, then we can see that we successfully injected a frame. And this works against earlier Linux kernel versions, and we'll later on see some side channels that work on more recent kernel versions as well. So the reason why this works is the following code snippet. So this is somewhere in the Linux kernel, and what we see here is that the receiver decrypts the frame, then checks the power safe flags, and at the end, it will check the MAC. This means that if the receiver verifies the power safe flags, it means we must have succeeded in the decryption. Otherwise, we would not reach that stage. And this is something we can exploit. So let's say we have an adversary somewhere in the network, which does not need to have a man-in-the-middle position. All the frames can be received. There's no issue there. So we capture, as an adversary, we can capture a frame, and then we will try to perform the ChopChop attack. So what we do is we set the power safe flag in the header in the hope to have this frame accepted to the access point. So here we will try 265 times this same frame for each of the possible values of the plain text byte. And there's a few tricks we need to do with this. The first one is we need to set the fragmentation number, because if you recall from the TKIP header, the MAC is only added to the last frame. So if we change this captured frame to be the first fragment of many, then the receiver will not try to check the MAC. And that's important because we cannot modify the MAC at this point. So if we can delay this check, then we can bypass its verification. And additionally, we need to work with the sequence counter, because we need to pass these verifications because we are trying to replay this frame. And we can do this by using a different quality of service channel. And there are 8 such channels, so we can reuse the 7 others to inject this frame on, because one of them is very likely to have a lower sequence counter. So if we corrected this frame correctly, the access point will enter power save mode. And we can find out by sending this power save poll frame. And if we do not receive a reply from the access point, then we know that our frame was rejected, and that is because we made the wrong ICV correction. However, if the access point replies with this buffered or null data frame, then we know that our client has entered power save mode, and that means we made the correct guess for the plain text byte. And then at that point, we have successfully decrypted 1 byte, and we can keep on doing this for the entire frame. So since the demonstration is unlikely to work like this, I luckily added some slides into this presentation of a Wireshark trace. So here we see one execution of what I just explained, whereas this first frame is the legitimate frame from the client. So it's just sent and received by the access point. Next, we modify this frame. So we had to make 3 modifications. That is, change the header flag to have it enter power save mode, then change the fragmentation number, and change the quality of service channel. So by making these modifications, we can send a power save poll frame to the access point. And in this case, the access point replies, which means we made the correct guess. And by analyzing the traffic like this, we can see if we made a correct guess for our plain text byte. So that's a very convenient way of decrypting 1 byte at a time, because this technique bypasses all TKIP countermeasures. So this does not rely on any of the TKIP Michael-Mick failure reports, because we are delaying the check for the Michael-Mick, which means since it's not checked, there can be no errors on it, so which means we are bypassing all of these countermeasures. And this allows us to decrypt the frame, or at least recover the Michael-Mick in 1 to 4 minutes, which is much faster than the previous attacks that existed against TKIP. So now one of the common countermeasures against the previous attacks was to reduce the rekeying interval. So it said, what if instead of every hour we rekey or keys every 5 minutes? Then it means that the adversary is not able to perform this attack in 7 to 8 minutes. But since we do this much faster now, we're also bypassing these countermeasures. So next, we looked at some MediaTek devices, and we found some interesting issues with fragmentation there. And what we found was that if we send a frame with a wrong ICV, the MediaTek device will clear its fragmentation cache. And if the frame is correct, then the cache is cleared. So that means the cache is affected. So if the ICV is wrong, the frame is dropped. And this allows us to make a quite interesting side channel as well, where we send a first fragment, and this could, for example, be an ARP request, because we want to know if this frame is reassembled. And the best way to do so is to construct a frame that will trigger a reply. So if we send an ARP request as a fragment, then we can send the first fragment, then we try our shop frame. So this will influence the state of the cache at the access point. And if our ICV was corrected constructly, then the cache will be cleared, which means we will not receive a reply. So when we send our second fragment, we're not really sure what's going to happen. Either the frame will be dropped or reassembled with the first fragment, depending on what happened in the cache. So if our frame was dropped, it means that the fragments can be reassembled, which means the access point will reply with its ARP reply. And if we detect this, then we know we made a wrong guess. However, if we do not receive a reply from the access point, it means the cache was cleared and we made a correct guess. So this is another means of decrypting 1 byte at a time. Next, we also looked at hardware decryption features. So many modern chips have the possibility to offload some of the encryption to the hardware drivers, and there we can find some side channels if these frames are passed along to the operating system or not. So a reason why a hardware encryption might drop a frame is because of an incorrect ICV, which is relating back to making our guesses for this ICV correction. So we can do a similar side channel to the power management, except we're now leveraging the hardware decryption features. And this works on all more recent Linux versions, which means we have a side channel that works on each of the kernel versions. So the difference here now is we've splitted the access point into its hardware and software features. And if the ICV is incorrect, the hardware will drop the frame. So very similar to before, we can send our shop frames, and if it's dropped, we will not receive a reply. However, if it is passed along to the operating system, then it means that the client will enter power save mode, and we can use our power save poll to retrieve this data. So These hardware decryption features are also very useful to constructing these side channels. And we find a bunch more in these, for which we do not have enough time to talk about today, but they are mentioned in the white paper that will be online tonight. And there's also features like retransmission detection, block acknowledgement, and replay detection features that can be leveraged to build more side channels. And every implementation that we looked at, we found some of these side channels. At least one worked against any of these implementations, which showed us that there's a lot of difficulty in making a secure implementation of TKIP, which is yet another reason to not use it anymore. So what we've seen at this point is we have a means of decrypting 1 byte at a time, which allows us to decrypt a frame. And we have a bunch of side channels that use against a large variety of implementation of devices and operating systems. And that's all pretty cool. But if we can now decrypt this frame, what more can we do? What is the real impact of this? And for this, we need to think back to our TKIP header, where we see the encrypted part as the data and 12 bytes for the Michael MIC and ICV. And we are only interested in this point at decrypting these last 12 bytes, because we want to recover the Michael MIC and the ICV. And if we know what some of the contents are of a frame, and an easy example would be an ARP request. If you sniff an ARP request on the network, which is easily detectable by its length, then we can make some very educated guesses on what is the plain text values of these ARP requests. And it's, depending on your network configuration, it may only be 1 or 2 bytes that you would have to brute force to recover the plain text value of this, which means it goes very fast. So if we manage to decrypt this frame, we have obtained some key stream. We know the plain text value of the frame. We have the encrypted part of this, so we know which plain text bytes match these encrypted parts. And this key stream is very interesting, because key stream will allow us to inject messages, which I will explain on the next slide. So we want more key stream. The more key stream we can obtain, the more messages we can later on inject into the network. And since we already recovered the Michael MIC key in the first frame we decrypt, then we are only interested in the last 4 frames, because 4 bytes, because we can decrypt the other contents of this frame, because we already know the Michael MIC at that point, which means after the first frame, our attack will be much faster to generate key stream, because we only need to decrypt these last 4 bytes. So if you have this key stream and we know the Michael MIC key, then we know from other researchers that it's very easy to inject network traffic. And this was shown already, this is now 6 years ago, that we can do this. So using some of these existing attacks, it allows us to inject more network traffic. And this is where we again see the quality of service channels, where since we can use our recovered key stream to inject messages on a channel with a lower TKIP sequence counter. So that allows us to bypass the sequence counter check, which means we can basically replay some of the key stream into the network. So that's all pretty bad, but it's still a major improvement over some of the other works, since we bypass all existing countermeasures, and as a result, we don't rely on them, because some of the attacks rely on the Michael MIC failure reports, and because we don't, our attacks are much faster. So as we've seen before, in a mere 1 to 4 minutes, we can already achieve these attacks of decrypting and injecting network traffic. And there are some countermeasures we can make to our attacks, and which could be reducing the rekeying interval even more, or disable these Michael MIC failure reports at all, or basically fix an outdated protocol, which we could make some software changes to only process frames if after reassembling them. So do not process intermediate frames, but only the reassembled parts of them. But that's really fixing an outdated protocol that's already 16 years old, and there's really no point in doing so. We should really just leave it behind and move on to the better protocols that we already have today. So that brings up an interesting question. If these attacks work against TKIP, then what about WPA2? Fortunately, it doesn't work against these because WPA2 uses CCMP with an AES block cipher, and some of the changes they made there as compared to TKIP is they calculate a message integrity check for every frame. So we cannot postpone the check, the authenticity check over frames anymore, like we were able to do with TKIP, because hence there we were able to set the fragmentation number so that Michael Mick is only checked in the last frame, which is never transmitted. So that no longer works in CCMP. And similarly, the CCMP-MAC is not known to be invertible, so we cannot exploit this feature. So CCMP will immediately, for every frame it receives, do a validation for its data integrity and its origin authentication, which is very important in these kind of networks. So to summarize, our side channels work against TKIP because TKIP will perform operations against decrypted but unauthenticated data. And they are processed before being reassembled. So there was a demonstration coming if my laptop worked, but luckily I added some screenshots of this as well, so we can run over these. What I wanted to show, and this is all published on GitHub, which is this URL, all the information is there. It's very easy to set up the demonstration. All the scripts to set it up are there, so that should work nicely. The side channel that is described on the GitHub is the power management side channel. And if you execute this, this is what this looks like. So you can, for each of the 12 bytes, we are trying to figure out what is the plain text value. So we see on average, we will make 128 guesses to get the right message. And this allows us to decrypt our message. And as a result from doing this, we have some key stream, and we can inject some messages into the network, and so on. I added some screenshots, fortunately, about how this works. So this is a Wireshark dump of what you would see in the air if we perform this attack. So in these first two messages, we see how the adversary is trying to adjust the frame and get the client to enter in power management mode. But it sends the power safe poll to the access point, to which no reply is received, which means the adversary made the wrong guess. So after a few more tries, we see that we receive a null data frame, which means there is no data buffered for the client. And this is an indication that we made the correct guess for our chopped off byte. And you can repeat this for every byte you want to decrypt. So later on, we'll see how the length of our frame is decreasing because we've successfully decrypted 1 byte at a time. So to conclude, what this really means is there is still a very large support for TKIP. And that is something that really worried us. And it's something we should no longer do because we found a lot of issues with these. And these novel side channels that we found are a real indication that it's very difficult to implement this particular protocol without having these side channel vulnerabilities against it. And the reason why we found a bunch of these is because we did some cross-layer analysis. And I think that's a general takeaway that is not just relevant to Wi-Fi networks, but in whichever field you are working on. This could be a very interesting thing to do more often than we already do, because it still today revealed so many vulnerabilities in a protocol that has been out there 16 years. So it's worth your while to investigate these cross-layer features as well. And hopefully this enabled us to finally accelerate the process of no longer using TKIP. So hopefully when you all go home and you go to your work or your home, you can check if TKIP is still supported, and if it is, it's really time to disable this. So that's the very simple recommendation of today. Leave it behind, and we have more and better security protocols, so it's really time to start using them. To leave on a bit of a positive note, this is a page from Microsoft of features they're no longer developing, and they've recently announced that web and TKIP will soon no longer be supported in Windows, so that's about time, and hopefully this will be happening very soon. So thank you. I also had a video of the demonstration, if we're able to show this. So we saw the Wireshark dump, and this is the demonstration that happened today. So on the left, we started an access point. On the right, we started a client. So now there is a connection set up between this client and network, and as an adversary, we can now try to capture a TKIP frame, which will then be decrypted. So to make it a bit easier, we can inject some ARP messages. That's on the right bottom corner. It's just a quick comment to inject some ARP traffic. So if the adversary sniffs for traffic, it will capture a frame and will slowly start to decrypt this. So right now it's trying the 265 possible values for this plain text byte. So one by one, we will see these bytes coming along. And here we are decrypting the last 12 bytes, which is the ICV and the Michael MIC. So sometimes it takes a bit longer when we're a bit unfortunate with the number of tries, but eventually we will have decrypted these last 12 bytes, and at that point we can then recover the ARP message and then do all our further attacks, such as injecting more network traffic. So I can leave this running in the background, and maybe in the meantime take some questions if there are any.
Just to clarify, is it a protocol problem or an implementation problem?
This is mostly an implementation problem, but you may also argue it's a protocol issue, because in the protocol they say that the definition says that we should add the Michael MIC to the last frame. So that's then more of a protocol issue, because it allows for a recipient to process frames that are not authenticated. So that's one of the issues they fixed with WPA2, where they authenticate every individual frame, every fragment. So it's a bit a combination of both. We are at 6 bytes, so almost there. Yes.
You said you're going to publish a paper today?
Yes.
Where we can find the paper?
On the Black Hat website, I assume, together with the presentation and the white paper, which describes a bunch more side channel attacks as what I presented today.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, that's 9 bytes. Any other questions, perhaps? All right, so these last bytes seem to have went pretty quick. So after decrypting the last 12 bytes, we can recover the Michael MIC and the ICV, and from this we can brute force the contents of our ARP reply. And since we know what kind of, we can make an educated guess for our network, so it's only brute forcing 1 or 2 bytes there, so that goes very quick, as you saw. Thank you.